you've done a PhD in a field which has nothing to see with caustic hydrology, right? So he has a PhD in astrophysics, right? And then after a postdoc at University of Minnesota, am I correct?
That's right.
Yeah, and then in Slovenia to explore, I guess, to explore caves.
This was a part of it, yes.
Yeah, he changed totally his discipline and is now a prominent associate professor at University of Arkansas and one of the main actors on caustic hydrology. So the floor is yours, and thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much. About a week and a half ago, I managed in some foolish acrobatics to fracture my hip. Luckily, it was a very minor fracture, and I was still able to come here today. I just hope I don't forget that I can't dance around on the stage. If I fall over, then someone can come pick me up. Okay, so to start out, actually, I didn't have to come from too far. So I am a professor at the University of Arkansas, but I'm currently on sabbatical and working with some collaborators at the Karst Research Institute in Slovenia. So I was coming from Slovenia, where I'm working mostly with Franci Gavršek, who's one of the collaborators in the work that I'll present here. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to come here. For me, this was pretty timely. I think here in France, you're a little bit ahead in thinking about critical zone processes in carbonates. All of the critical zone observatories in the US are on non-carbonates. And we just recently got some funding from NSF for a 5-year research coordination network looking at questions of critical zone processes in carbonate settings. And this is not an observatory, but it's designed to develop community and try to identify the interesting questions, the things that we really don't know. And the main thing we'll be doing here is organizing a series of workshops, which you're very welcome to attend. We're hoping to bring in some people from abroad. We have some support for bringing in people, so apply and hopefully we can support your trip to come and discuss with us the mysteries of critical zone processes in carbonates. If you just search critical zone carbonates, you'll find this pretty quickly in the Google results. So the question that I want to look at today is think about changes in carbonate weathering rates through the critical zone and what controls changes in both space and time. And I'm going to start out more in, I guess, is there a pointer or maybe not? Okay. More thinking about conduits here on the left, and which are accessible, where we can go into the critical zone and we can see what's going on. And then towards the end, I'm going to start to think more broadly about what might be going on outside of those conduits. Thanks. So when we first started looking at this question, the first thing that I did was go to the USGS database, which has all of this water chemistry all over the US. And we picked a set of sites that had good data coverage. And we tried to understand what's controlling the dissolution rates in these streams and how they vary. And to do this, I developed a Python package called Olm, which is named after the largest cave-adapted species in the world, Proteus, which lives in Slovenia. And what Olm can do is download data from the USGS database. It can do a bunch of automatic speciation calculations in freq-C, and then also calculations related to carbonate chemistry and specifically dissolution rates. And then it does a bunch of statistics and creates a bunch of plots for you. On the bottom here, you can't quite see it, but I haven't quite figured out how to make it write the journal articles for me, but it does a lot of things for me. And so the nice thing about Olm is I go out and I select the sites that I want data from, and then I hit go, and I go get a coffee, and then I come back, and I've got all of this data to look at. So these are relationships between discharge and calcite dissolution rate in streams in a wide variety of settings. The main takeaway message from this work, which was published in a GRL paper almost 5 years ago now, is that CO2 was really the dominant control of dissolution rate variability in these streams. So on these axes, I have histograms where each thing I'm counting is a correlation coefficient between dissolution rate and some parameter of interest. Here it's PCO2, here it's discharge, here it's calcium concentration. And really the strongest correlations consistently were with PCO2. Okay, but it's nice to look at this big scale, but it would be even better if we could understand mechanistically what's going on at an individual site in order to control these variations. What's causing the CO2 to change? So the first site that we looked at is the Savoy Experimental Watershed, which is owned by the University of Arkansas. This is where my first master's student, Kiefer Vaughn, did his thesis work. And we just recently published this in the special issue of Chemical Geology that's on carbonate critical zone processes. Here we worked at two springs, Langle and Copperhead. And these springs make up an underflow-overflow system. There's a sinking stream here that comes, and it feeds both of these springs. But at low flow, most of this water goes to the underflow spring, Langle, which is less developed, it's smaller, but it tends to have higher base flow. And then during flood events, the overflow spring acts as kind of a pressure relief valve, and it takes a lot of that extra discharge. This is a really common thing to find in karst settings. And what we did at these sites is we installed CO2 gas sensors that were waterproof with a waterproof breathable membrane, and then you stick it in the water. It's kind of scary the first time you do this, but then we figured out they can actually last for years in the field and survive this way. And this allows you to directly measure the PCO2 of the water instead of worrying about trying to calculate it from pH, which is pretty hard to keep running reliably in the field. So all the sites, all the data I'll be showing you, this is how we were measuring the CO2. When you think about underflow-overflow systems, you can also think about how these relate to the evolution of a karst system. So you very frequently form a conduit somewhere near base level, and then as base level falls, you increase the hydraulic head gradients and you start to develop some lower level of a conduit. And over time, that upper level may be eventually completely abandoned, and then the water flows in the lower level. So the site that we have here is something like this, where some of the water is able to make it into this lower level, but not all of it. For that reason, we can also think of these two springs as a little bit different stages of evolution of a karst conduit. One is in the earlier stage and one is in a more mature stage. So if we look at the CO2 dynamics at these springs over a little more than 2 years, we see there's a nice seasonal pattern. And it's a bit stronger at the underflow spring, Langle, than it is at the overflow spring. And sure enough, if you look at weekly average temperatures, particularly at the underflow spring, Langle, you have a nice correlation between temperature and PCO2, which makes a lot of sense because in higher temperatures, we're producing more CO2 from more rapid microbial decay, from more rapid root respiration. So the growing season has an impact on these CO2 concentrations. There's also a relationship at Copperhead Spring, but you'll notice there's quite a bit more scatter at this overhead or overflow spring. And we'll get into that in a minute. If we look at the saturation state of those springs over time, the underflow spring, which is down here, is almost always undersaturated. Whereas the overflow spring spends a lot of its time being supersaturated and is really only aggressive and actively dissolving during periods of high flow or high PCO2. So it's much more intermittent in its dissolution. One other thing that we did at this site was we actually measured limestone dissolution rates to get an idea of whether our calculations from these time series had anything to do with reality or not. So we're deploying these in the field, we're weighing them before and after, and we're measuring how much mass loss they have. And we have a couple of different ways of calculating these rates. In both cases, we find that there's sort of a one-to-one relation in that when we calculate there should be higher dissolution, there's higher mass loss from the tablets. In the case of this Palmer equation, which is more appropriate for limestone as opposed to pure calcite, we actually do a pretty good job of predicting the mass loss rate on these tablets. So this convinced us that these dissolution rates probably aren't too far away from what the system is really experiencing. Okay, so if we go back to this seasonal signal, in the spring we see this run-up of PCO2 in both of the springs. But then the overflow spring dramatically drops, and this happens every year, except for occasionally during high flow events where it goes back up. And this is roughly corresponds to the time that the flow is decreasing in the middle of the summer when you have high evapotranspiration. And sure enough, if you plot the ratio of the two PCO2s versus the discharge at the overflow spring, you find at high discharge, they're pretty similar, close to 1. But when you get to low discharge, there's this threshold where suddenly the underflow spring has 3 times the PCO2 of the overflow spring. Now, unfortunately, we can't go inside this system, but our hypothesis here is that below some certain stage, portions of this overflow path are transitioning to an open channel flow. They're completely phreatic, and then they become open channel. And then we start to get degassing of the CO2 before it can reach the spring, and this reduces the CO2. We can also think about this in terms of the evolution of karst aquifers, and we can ask a question, well, is it typical that these underflow routes might experience much higher PCO2 and higher dissolution rates than the overflow routes? Because they're isolated from the atmosphere, they can't get rid of this excess CO2. Some of you might be thinking, maybe, but wait a minute, this is like the opposite of what we would normally think of about open and closed systems regarding PCO2. A closed system doesn't have access to additional PCO2, so PCO2 can be drawn down as calcite dissolution occurs. In an open system, you have access to more, you have contact with some fixed PCO2 gas. So how does this, how is it that this closed part of the system is actually evolving faster at higher PCO2? This is the conceptual framework that we've used to think about this. So in the really early stages of conduit development, where you have closed system conditions, you have a situation where the time scale for dissolution is less than or similar to the flow-through time of your path. So if you put in high PCO2 water, that PCO2 drops as it goes along the flow path and calcite is dissolved, because that dissolution process is rapid compared to how quickly the water can go through, right? But in our underflow spring, we have a relatively fast flow-through time compared to the time scales over which dissolution occurs. So it is technically a closed system, but the water is going so quickly through that it doesn't matter it's closed. It still evolves at fixed PCO2 all the way through. And this is what gives it those fast dissolution rates. Then as the system starts to mature and we have portions of it that are translating to, or transitioning to open channel, and you get some ventilation through here, as long as you have a situation where the degassing time scale is less than the flow-through time scale, which it typically is, then when you reach that ventilated portion, your PCO2 can drop and your dissolution rates will also drop in that portion of the system. So this is what we think we're seeing at our overflow spring copperite. Okay, but we couldn't go inside here. We wanted to get a little more deeply into these questions. And so we went to Blowing Springs Cave, which is not too far away, developed in the same limestone. And here you can go inside and we can measure ventilation processes. And so what we did here was, again, we measured CO2, we measured it in the cave water, and we measured it in the cave air. And then on top of that, we measured the velocity of the cave airflow in the main passage. And here again, we see this nice seasonal signal where CO2 is going high in the summer and then is going low in the winter. This also corresponds to the patterns of ventilation. And if you zoom in on some of this, you can see that really the airflow is driving these CO2 patterns. So up here we have the airflow velocity. This dashed line is 0 airflow. So whenever it's in the red down here, it's pulling air in the main cave entrance from outside. And whenever it's above that line, it's blowing air back out that main cave entrance. So during these reversals where it's sucking air in, the PCO2 in the air drops way down suddenly as this wave of outside air comes in. And when we have periods of time where it's reversed like this for longer, you see that the CO2 in the water also starts to come down. It takes a few days, but the water starts to lose CO2 as a result of this fresh air that's coming in. Just an aside here on the mechanism that's driving this airflow, it's what's referred to as chimney effect airflow. And this is what makes a chimney work. So in the winter, in general, the cave is roughly the same temperature. So in the winter, outside it's colder and the cave air is warm and it's buoyant because it's less dense. And so it tends to rise up and out upper openings. Now you don't have to have a big opening that a human can go through. This cave we're working in here does not have any human-sized upper openings. Fractures are enough as long as you've got enough of these. In the summer, the situation reverses and airflow will come from the upper entrances to the lower entrances. And this process is described by this square root function of the temperature difference between inside and outside the cave. And if we just fit that type of function to our airflow velocities, we can see this does a pretty good job of explaining the airflow velocity patterns in the cave. So we're confident this is the process that's driving the airflow for the most part. Now, if we think about how this relates to CO2, in the winter, fresh air is coming from outside and filling this whole zone with atmospheric concentrations of CO2. But in the summer, air is coming down mostly through fairly restricted flow paths because there are no human-sized upper entrances, through this high CO2 zone where you have microbial decay of organic matter, you have root respiration, and it's bringing that high PCO2 down into the cave air, and then the cave water is also able to maintain a high PCO2 during that period. So this nicely explains the pattern that we see here with the seasons, where it's the airflow direction that matters in this case. And the really cool thing, if we look at dissolution rates in the cave stream, which we would calculate from this chemistry, it's a little more noisy, but there's a big sinusoidal pattern, which is entirely driven by the airflow. So most of the variability in dissolution rates in this cave stream relate to which direction the air is flowing. On top of this, you see a little bit of noise, which is your storm events. And we can quantify this a little more carefully by looking at dissolution rates here on all of these y-axes, and then airflow here and discharge in this column, where we're averaging over different timescales. So this is daily timescales. We have Spearman rank correlation coefficients that show we have sort of similar correlation between dissolution rate and airflow velocity or discharge on this daily timescale. Once we move to weekly timescale, we have much stronger correlation with airflow velocity than we do with discharge. And the correlation gets even stronger when you go out to monthly timescale. So on the long timescales, it's really the airflow that's driving the dissolution rates, not the discharge. And this kind of flies in the face of the way we normally think about these things. Most of you, hopefully a lot of you are familiar with this paper. You know, we normally think about, especially in stream channels, we think about its flood events. That's when all the action occurs. So if we want to ask the question, well, how much is it eroding right now? The question we ask ourselves is, how much is it flowing? The more it's flowing, the more it's eroding. But in this cave, that's not what we see. The question we need to ask here is, which way is it blowing? If it's blowing out, it's dissolving. And it's sucking in, it's not dissolving. It's supersaturated. Okay, kind of bizarre. Not what we expected to find. Okay, but not only that, not only does it sort of influence these long-term variations in airflow, we've also found that it modulates how much the discharge can impact the airflow, impact the dissolution rates. And we first started finding this when we look, this is dissolution rate here on the x-axis, a histogram of dissolution rate. And we broke it into two groups depending on the direction of airflow that day on average. And during downward airflow, summer conditions, you have this narrow peak at high dissolution rates. But during upward airflow, on average, it's basically zero. But you have a very broad peak that goes all the way up here where the downward airflow goes as well. And my first thought was, well, this is during the winter when there's no evapotranspiration. There's probably more discharge variability during this time. That's why it's more variable. But that turned out not to be the case. So if we we look at the amount dissolution rate changes during a storm event. We've identified all of our storms here. And we plot that versus the mean cave airflow velocity. It's very nicely correlated. During periods of inward airflow, there's much more variability in dissolution rate during a storm than outward airflow. Whereas if we look at how much the discharge is changing in an individual storm, there's not any correlation at all with how much the dissolution rate changes. It doesn't matter how much the discharge changes. Okay, again, this was a little bit of a surprise to me, but if you look at the individual events, it starts to make more sense. So here are a couple of examples. This is a winter rainfall event, and it starts out at pretty low PCO2, around 1,000 ppm, and the PCO2 more than triples during the period of this storm. In summer, it starts out high, and it never really goes much above 5,000 in this cave, so it doesn't have much room to go up. So your PCO2 only changes a little bit during the summer event. So this is why there's so much more variability in the winter. It's because your PCO2 is starting out at this low point. So if we draw this out conceptually, in the summer, we have a situation where our CO2 source is connected into our cave system through this airflow. And so our cave water already has this high PCO2. They're in connection with each other. In the winter, we've disconnected our cave from the source of CO2. When we have a storm event, that vertically flowing water can bring the CO2 from up here back down into the cave and reconnect it temporarily. And I think that's what's driving this additional variability during the winter storms. Okay, so this is a situation we see at our sites. There have been very few studies that have looked at these time series of dissolution rates. One of the few other studies was done in 2005, I guess you guys probably can't see this, by Groves and Lyman in Mammoth Cave, and they find something a bit different than what we found. These black lines are dissolution rates, and the gray lines up here are discharge. They see active dissolution is mostly occurring during flood events. Most of the time it's supersaturated, and you only get pulses of dissolution when it floods. So the argument I would like to make is that this is what you might consider a highly ventilated in-member. Mammoth Cave has hundreds of entrances, many of which are human size, right? And this whole system is pretty well ventilated. And because of that, I think the cave stream is typically in this state of having low PCO2 and not much dissolution occurring. During flood events, two things happen. You can dilute your dissolved load, but then you also flood portions of the system and you shut off that ventilation. And both of these processes could be driving this. So I want to summarize this part of the talk and just looking at the types of patterns that we see here. The first one was at our underflow spring where we don't have any ventilation. And here the question we want to ask if we want to know how much is it dissolving. We ask, is it growing? Right? During the summer when everything is growing and everything is decaying more rapidly, the roots are respiring, we get higher PCO2. There are also some systems that show in karst that show very constant PCO2. I don't know exactly why some do and some don't. I think that's an interesting research question. But at least in our site, we see this nice seasonal signal where it's always actively dissolving. This is the zero dissolution line here. And then the next pattern we saw was the is it blowing? So this is where we sometimes have ventilation and we sometimes don't. And it's this switch between no ventilation to ventilation that creates a lot of the big patterns that we see in the dissolution rate variability over time. And then we have the which way is it blowing? Okay, maybe I like rhyming too much, but which way is it blowing? This is what we see at blowing springs, where as the airflow switches directions with the seasons, it drives either supersaturated or undersaturated state in the water. And finally, if it's extremely ventilated, then we have the situation where it's almost always supersaturated, except during these events where we're getting these pulses of dissolution occurring. I would also argue that in this case, it's probably mechanical erosion in the cave stream that's actually the most important, because this is so intermittent and mechanical erosion rates are going to be high during these same periods of time. Okay, so this is my current thinking on how the conduit part of the system works. But I want to think a little more broadly, and maybe some of you guys would say, well, yeah, ventilation is important in the caves, but what about the rest of the Vadose zone? You're not going to fly a kite in a fracture, right? This is a guy actually flying a kite in a cave in China. Some friends of mine went on an expedition there. They found this giant cave passage, and they said the airflow is so strong you could fly a kite. And nobody believed them. And so the next year, one of their goals was to actually fly a kite in this passage, and they showed that you can fly a kite. Okay, but what's going on in the fractures? Normally when we think about CO2 transport and production in the Vadose zone, the model that we use is one of diffusion, where you have CO2 being produced at depth and gradually diffusing towards the surface. We don't have a whole lot of profiles of CO2 through karst Vadose zones, but some of the only ones I'm aware of show features like this. Diffusion does not like these sharp features. This does not look like an equilibrium diffusion profile to me. This looks to me like it's ventilated up here and it's not ventilated down here. So some sort of advective process going on. We can think a bit, just sort of some back of the envelope calculations of how this might work, where it might be important. And so again, the mechanism we're thinking about is this chimney effect airflow, where maybe now we're considering a network of fractures that happens to have openings at two different elevations, some height difference h. And we can quantify the relative importance of advective and diffusive transport with a Peclet number. And if we do that, and we consider this chimney effect airflow model, we can write down equations for Peclet numbers in laminar and turbulent flow cases where the flow is driven by this chimney effect flow. You can see this temperature difference in here. And then we can look at the parameter space and see what kind of Peclet numbers we get. So each of these lines here corresponds to a choice in elevation difference between the two fracture openings, all the way from 300 meters on this top line to 30 centimeters on the bottom line. And this line is roughly the transition between diffusive and effective dominated transport. On the x-axis here, we have the aperture of the fracture. And the basic takeaway message here is if we're more than like a millimeter size fracture, which a lot of fractures are more than a millimeter, then we're in this advectively dominated regime. Even if we only have 30 centimeters of difference between where these fractures hit the surface. So you don't have to have a lot of topographic relief to drive these sorts of flows. Okay, maybe some of you are thinking this. Okay, when I don't have any cover, my fractures are all hitting the surface, you better bet advection is important here. But what about here? This is what some of the karst looks like where I'm from in Arkansas, where you have like a 20-meter thick regolith full of clay and so on. Maybe you don't have a lot of ventilation through that. So we can add this into our little toy model here and consider a permeable cover of some sort that's placed in series with our fracture. And you can rework the equation. What you find is there's an upper limit to your Peclet number in this case, which is controlled by the permeability of the soil. Once you make your fracture big enough, then all of your head loss is in the soil. And so it doesn't change anymore when you make it bigger. And we can play around with this permeability number, and we can find that in some cases, with a relatively permeable soil, you still ought to be having advective transport through those fractures. But if you make your soil impermeable enough, then you start to lose that effect of advective transport through the fractures. So, the basic takeaway here is that you've got realistic cases where a cover can still allow advective transport, or it may shut it down. And the last thing I want to consider here is thinking about advection of water. So again, we build a very simple model where we have a fracture here, and it's got a gas phase and then a film of water that's flowing vertically on the fracture wall. And we have some CO2 production here at the interface between the rock and the wall. And we want to look at how this vertical flow of the water might influence CO2 profiles. And to do this, we use an advection dispersion gas exchange model with both the air, CO2 in the air and CO2 in the water. And we can just plug in some typical parameters. This is the one example that I'll show you because it nicely illustrates how big an effect water can have. This is what the profile would look like if it were diffusion. This is what it looks like. And all of that is created by the vertical flow of the water. Otherwise, it would be doing this, because I actually don't have any airflow in this particular model run. I've shut off the airflow, so it's only diffusion here. The water is dramatically perturbing the CO2 profile. And these parameters are fairly typical. They're not, I didn't have to search long and hard to find these. This is described in a paper, special paper in GSA from a few years ago. I think some of these slides had the reference way down there, but and we go into more details in the paper. But the basic takeaway is that also vertical flow of water may substantially perturb these CO2 profiles with depth. So my conclusion is that karst is guilty of advection unless proven innocent. So rather than starting at a point where we assume it's diffusive transport of gases in the subsurface, our starting point maybe should be an advective starting point, where we assume there's advection of gases through the subsurface, unless we have good reason to think that there's not. And the final thought that I want to leave you with here, it kind of brings together the two parts of this talk, is thinking about how interactions between these basal conduits and the Vadose zone might impact critical zone processes. So if we imagine this case where our conduit at the base is completely phreatic, our fractures hit the water table, but they don't have a lot of, they don't have access to this huge potential gradient unless they're right on the steep hill slope. And so you probably have less advection here and slower velocities, higher CO2. Once you open up this basal conduit, you have this huge hydraulic gradient to be pushing airflow through the system. In addition to that, during winter flow conditions, you're aerating the critical zone from below. So any sort of chemical process that's limited by available oxygen, you're pumping oxygen up into the bottom of the critical zone. And it seems to me like that ought to be important. I don't know exactly what the implications of it are, but I'd like to think about that more. Okay, so just to conclude here, CO2 is arguably the primary driver of spatial and temporal variability in dissolution rates in karst systems. We find that surface air temperatures influence the production rates. We didn't find this, lots of people know this, but that can control the PCO2 in the water. As we move deeper and into more well-developed parts of the system, it's often the ventilation that controls the PCO2. And these patterns of ventilation influence both the timing, when is it going to be actively dissolving, and the location. You know, whether you're near an upper or a lower entrance may matter a lot in terms of when it's going to be actively dissolving or how much it might be dissolving. As karst systems mature, they ventilate more. And this may actually mean they slow down over time. They don't develop as rapidly as they did to begin with. And finally, advective transport of CO2, both in the air and in the water, is typically dominant in karst systems rather than diffusive transport. And with that, hopefully I have some time for questions.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, we have time for questions. So I can give you the micro if you want. Any questions? Yeah, Hervé.
Yes, Matt, thank you very much for this very nice talk. Just a question, when we are caving, sometimes in a deep shaft, we observe a kind of stratification of CO2 concentration, and from, let's say, 0.500 ppm to 3500 ppm, such very sharp change. And I was wondering if you can relate this effect of stratification to what you just showed us, which is related to the flow along the shaft of the thin pellicle of water that may change from advective to diffusive processes.
Yeah, so it is true that sometimes in caves, particularly in shafts that aren't very well connected to much of anything else, you can hit a very sharp stratification of CO2. And cavers don't like this. This, I think, is an indication that at least below that level, you don't have much ventilation, which would remove this. I think also if you add a waterfall into that shaft, the water is going to be both mixing the gases, but then also vertically transporting gases from above down below. So I think this is probably less likely to happen in a case where you have a waterfall, though. I don't know. The cases I know of where you have high CO2 in pits, you don't typically have flowing water, but there may be such cases. I think this is, often it's where you have a lot of accumulation of fine sediments and organic matter at depth in the pit that's producing CO2 and also probably sealing off any ventilation below that point.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for your very clear talk. I was very much interested in what you say about the thickness of the soil and its influence on the CO2. But I guess that most of the time your soils are very shallow on limestones because of the velocity of weathering of limestone.
Yeah, I mean, so it depends. So I think in general that's probably true. And that's one of the reasons why I would argue that you really ought to consider these advective processes, because most of the time you don't have a whole lot of cover. And what's there may still be permeable enough that these flows can get through. You do have cases like this one near where I live, where I would guess that there's not a lot of airflow. Here the limestones are very impure, and they have a lot of chert and clay that builds up on top. And so you can have tens of meters of regolith that's very clay rich and probably not very permeable. So I think there are cases, particularly where you have impure carbonates, where you get an impermeable enough cover to shut these processes down. But even here, vertical flow of water may be quite important from an advective perspective.
You have other questions? I have one, actually. I was very surprised to see that the water, the airflow in the cave and the dissolution rates are in phase. Because to me, dissolution is fast, but is not really, as fast as the movement of air in the cave. So I would have expected a delay or something like that. You see what I mean? Because the source, correct me if I'm not, or tell me if I'm wrong, but the source of CO2 is the vegetation, right? The composition of vegetation in the soil. So how can you have this phasing between the airflow and the dissolution rate?
Yeah, let's see if I can go back to my sketch of the cave. Oh, maybe this will work. So what typically happens is in the cave where we were working, you have something like a kilometer-long conduit that's filled with air. But the water's coming from a sump. It goes completely underwater. And the water coming out there is still high CO2. There's still probably some seasonal signal related to production. Unfortunately, we haven't instrumented it there. But when we've made spot measurements, we see that the CO2 at this upstream end is still high. So there's some interplay between the length scale of gas exchange and the length of your conduit. In our case, and I'm measuring down near the downstream end of this kilometer-long conduit, the effect would presumably be much smaller up here, where your water hasn't had much time to get rid of the CO2 it has. I think, I'm not completely sure I'm answering your question, but I think that may be what you were getting at. In terms of the quickness with which the dissolution changes, I mean, my dissolution rates are simply calculated from my PCO2 time series and my specific conductance time series. And so that's what we're seeing here is this time series converted into a dissolution rate. And so it will switch as quickly as I can switch the water PCO2, which if you look at this plot, it doesn't happen instantaneously. So the air changes with these really rapid changes. The water takes a little while. Mm-hmm. It seems that it takes a few days to really start removing enough CO2 from the water to have an effect on the dissolution rates. So the time scale is really the time scale for gas exchange between the water and the air that's limiting it.
Okay, so you're changing the carbonate system, water carbonate system, right? You're not influencing the dissolution. You're changing the way precipitation occurs, for example.
So this should relate to the instantaneous rate of dissolution in the stream, in the channel itself.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, not
okay.
not
I think
across.
We're not talking about exactly about the same
yeah.
thing, but that's a community issue.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Other questions? Okay. So thank you again, Matt, and so we can continue.